Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is Econ 741. This is a lecture on elections and transfers. What we're going to do today is run through an extension or simplification of the Meltzer-Richards model of redistribution and democracy. Their model is a rather kind of tough model. Basically, it assumes that all government does is engage in transfers. And the transfers that they model are what people call demogrants. That's a case where everyone gets the same amount of money. And basically you take from everybody, throw it into a pot, and divide it up equally and hand it back out to everyone. So people who have above average income, they pay in more than they get back. People with below average income, they receive more than they put in. Social Security in the U.S. actually works a bit like that. The folks at the lower end of the income distribution typically get really quite good returns on their contributions to the Social Security program, whereas persons at the upper end typically do not get as high a rate of return, and in some cases, adjusted for inflation, it's arguably close to zero or negative. And so what I've put on the board is kind of a slightly simplified version of the Meltzer-Richards model, and it's a way of characterizing it that makes the whole logic of their model, I think, sharper than what they did in their published paper in the JP. So let me go through the model, and I've written it up rather than writing it up in front of you, partly to make sure I didn't make an error, partly to make my handwriting more legible, and partly because I thought the lecture could be gone through a little bit faster if I have a lot of stuff already on board. So we have a simple utility function. Each individual gets utility from their own private consumption. And you can think of this as lifetime consumption if you want to. For the purposes of the illustration, this is just modeled as if it's a one-period event, but a lot of times the notion of period in economic models is ambiguous, and for some purposes you might want to think of this as lifetime utility. So this is a simple no-saving model, right? So if you thought of this as lifetime utility, there would be no inheritance at the end. And basically you have your after-tax income, 1 minus t times yi, where if this were a lifetime model, this would be lifetime income. If it's a one-period model, it would just be the income you earn in the year of interest, or period of interest, plus whatever you get from the demogrant program that's being funded with the tax. Now, I assume that the tax has a deadweight loss for most of the modeling, and that means that your own personal income tends to diminish as the tax increases. And that's because of deadweight losses in the tax system. In a model that included leisure, it would be because people are substituting labor for leisure. Okay. So this real simple way of writing the model does not pick up the leisure effect, okay. Which could be added without too much trouble, but it would cause some kind of more complex looking mathematics as you get further along in the model. I decided to keep it simple so you kind of see the essential elements of the Meltzer-Richards type of model. So if you use a demogrant system, basically you create your revenues as t times all the income that's produced. Okay, and each person would have a tax effect in their contributions. So as the taxes went up, the income level would go down. So there's a kind of reduction in the tax base that takes place as the taxes rise because of deadweight loss. And then you take all that money, divide it up, and give it back to all the taxpayers as there are n people. Okay. Getting this grant. So once you have the tax revenue, you know what the grant's going to be. You just take the tax revenue divided by the number of taxpayers or the number of citizens, and the result is G. that's this G up here, the grant, the demo grant, is coming from the government. Of course, it's coming from the government through taxes that are collected from everybody in society. Okay, so if you look at this expression here, you'll see that this is the sum of all income. If you take the sum of all income and divide by n, you actually have average income. All right, so I could write this expression a little more simply by focusing on average income instead of looking at sort of the summation of all the individuals' income in society. Okay, so I'm going to use this formulation in the next slide. So if I substitute the various relationships we've worked out here, this is a type of balanced budget rule for the economy. This is the individual's own private budget, and this is just a simplification of the balanced budget rule. So we can write down the utility of Mr. I, or Miss I, or Mrs. I, as a utility of 1 minus T times YI, that's their after-tax income, plus TYA, that's their grant, right, the demo grant coming out. So notice that this creates a nice optimization problem with just one variable. Okay, so that means we can write down the first order condition, not have to fool around with matrix methods, and you get a really clean looking first order condition. First order condition is just du dc times the derivative of the inside, and that will be minus yi from S to the minus t, plus 1 minus t times dy dt, right? So those two terms come from this one, right? The two derivatives of this multiplied term with respect to t. And this is the grant, right? So this would be, again, using the product rule, ya plus t times dya dt. And why is ya varied with t? It's because of this effect here. Okay, so the first term is really the marginal cost of the program to a typical taxpayer, right? To Mr. I or Miss I, Mrs. I. And basically that is the extra tax paid in, which is the minus yi term here, and the reduction in income because of the labor substitution effect that's going on, or the deadweight loss of the tax system. The second term, or second two terms, are really the marginal benefit from the transfer. Basically you get YA, or kind of increase, and when you increase tax, you get an increase in the benefits that's basically tracking along with the average income. But basically, and then it's reduced a bit because of the average income falls as taxes go up. But overall, that's the net benefit. So in Meltzer-Richards analysis, they focus most of their attention on the case, or really all their attention on the case where this type of condition can be satisfied. That is, where there's a unique T that reflects this trade-off between the extra benefits from the tax system generating, trickling through to a higher grant, and the cost being the reduction in personal income and some extent the reduction in GDP. Okay, so the case they're looking at, they're most interested in, looks like this. Okay, so every person in the society has their own ideal tax. And that tax, that ideal tax, is going to vary with their income. Okay, because the second term is the same for everybody. So it's only the income term that changes the calculus for the individuals. And so for people of median income, more or less in the middle of the distribution, they'll get a result that looks like this. Okay, so there would be a transfer program, an immigrant program of some size. It wouldn't include the entire economy, but it would be a significant tax. In this case, I've got it written at about 50%. And so the Democrat program would basically involve about half of GDP. Okay, so the median voter in equilibrium determines the size of the transfer program. And this is basically the result. However, when they did this, they didn't mention, possibly they didn't realize, that there are actually corner solutions in this setup. So if your average income, your income is greater than average income, then it turns out that your marginal benefits are always below your marginal costs for this program, right? Every time you increase the tax, it just lowers your consumption level. So for people with above average income, their ideal tax is zero, okay? No tax whatsoever, no transfers whatsoever. Okay, that's how they maximize their own consumption. On the other hand, if you're well below average in income, it turns out that your marginal benefits from the tax program could be greater than your marginal costs over the full range. Okay, that would not be an unusual or strange result. It's not necessarily the case because it depends on the extent of the deadweight loss of the tax. But it could easily be that that's the case. Persons with below average income believe to be the reality that they confront, in which case they would prefer a system with the tax being 100% and essentially the entire economy being tossed into this tax system. And the average grant in that case would just be average income, okay, given the tax system. So you have these two extreme types of voters. One group preferring no tax, and the other group preferring 100% tax. And if it turned out that one of those groups was dominant, okay, was it in the majority, then it's quite possible you could wind up with quite extreme forms of this demogrant program, either no redistribution whatsoever or complete redistribution, kind of an egalitarian system with relatively low GDP, okay, because of the tax burden, but a lot of equality. So for in the recent literature, say in the past 20 years, well after Meltzer-Richards were writing, there's been an increasing concern on the effect of inequality on economic growth rates. And those models typically assume that if you imposed a tax system that made the results more equal, that would be a good thing, either for an ideological reason that they prefer equality, that's just the way they think of ideal states of the world, or they believe, at least, and there's some econometric support for this, that societies that are a bit more egalitarian tend to grow faster than ones where there's a lot of inequality. That's debatable, by the way. There are results that show the opposite as well. So it turns out that this old model of government is relevant for some of today's policy issues, at least among folks who are interested in inequality. So if you're a utilitarian, it turns out that you might want to maximize average income because that would maximize average utility or close to it. In which case you might want to have really a really small transfer state. Okay, so there are, if you start with the Meltzer-Richards model and you add ideology in, you can get deviations from this result. In effect, it changes the marginal benefit curve. Right, so if there's a shift in the background ideology in society that favors a more egalitarian type of economic distribution of incomes, then support for the demogrant program increases because you get this new source of benefit. You get some kind of plus I term here on the benefit side, and that will induce a greater transfer state. And if you look at the pattern in Europe and to some extent in the U.S., there has been this basic shift to the left in ideology, center gravity. The extremes are still more or less where they were, but the middle, the bulk of the distribution has been moving to the left over the past, say, 60 years or something like that, more or less the whole period after 1960. And that's been true in Europe as well as the U.S., more so in Europe than the U.S. Generally. And the prediction of this sort of model would be that the transfer elements of the government program would tend to increase because of that shift to the left in an election-driven model. Right? In an election-driven model, you get median voter outcomes. As the median voter shifts left, other things being equal, they're going to prefer more redistribution, okay? Even in a demogrant system. The other thing that can happen is that if you have a lot of inequality and there's a similar shift, what can happen is you start to get almost radical redistribution, redistribution to the point where the society is actually quite poor because the high taxes used to do the income shuffling. So in that case, you can wind up with relatively equal societies that are really quite poor. And the economy has just really collapsed because of the labor leisure substitution, and also because investors decide it's not worth investing in stores or machinery or development of new firms simply because it'll be taxed away. Right? So it kind of reduces all the incentives for innovation that would increase efficiency and increase the output of the productive processes throughout the economy. And an example of that appears to be what's been going on in Venezuela for the past 20 or 30 years. So we do see that case occasionally. Okay. And to avoid what you might call the democratic poverty trap, might require some kinds of institutional constraints on the extent to which these types of redistribution programs are possible. Now, in most of the West, the redistribution that takes place looks a little bit like a demogrant program. Okay, in Europe, there is some taking of money from the rich and giving money to the poor, but most of what is going on there that flattens the income distribution, at least post net of taxes, net of benefits from government services, is relatively high levels of government service. And so you have tax finance and social insurance programs that we went through in the previous lecture. Those tend to be pretty high, and obviously if you spend 20% of your income or 15% of your income on healthcare, and you get it at a big discount through the tax system, then your income is, in real terms, higher than it was before, and the folks were, in a sense, subsidizing you by paying higher prices for those services poorer than they were before, and that obviously equalizes the income distribution to some extent. Same thing would be true of education. Same thing would be true of pension programs for the elderly that are tax financed. And the same thing would be true of many public services, like public education, like mass transit with subsidies, and so forth. So these kind of programs, when they're universally available, and people are actually mostly interested in those programs, tend to flatten the income distribution after taxes and after the public services are taken into account. And a lot of the greater inequality you see in, say, Scandinavian countries or in other parts of Western Europe occur not from this sort of program, the demogrant type of money transfers, but from these kind of services that are provided uniformly throughout the societies of interest. We do that a bit here in the U.S. as well. If you compute the equality after, not before tax, but after tax and after all the public services and transfers and various social insurance type programs, it turns out that we're a lot more equal after taxes than we are before taxes. And it's possible that this Meltzer-Richards model accounts for a lot of that flattening that's taken place over the past 50 years. And also this ideological shift that we've been experiencing may account for a good deal of it as well. So that completes this lecture on the dividing line between the public sector and the private sector. If you think through all four parts of it, it turns out that we do observe government programs that provide all four types of benefits for some citizens within those societies. There are private goods that are provided that largely for pragmatic reasons that benefit people who pay relatively low prices for these services when they're provided by the government because of the tax system. And so they have a narrow self-interest, a pragmatic interest in having the government provide these sorts of services. These include social insurance programs that are quite large throughout the West, and much larger today than they were back in 1950, also throughout the West. We also have pure public goods that are being provided. I think in 1950, or really up through the 70s, you could argue that most of the services provided by the government were efforts to provide pure public goods, national defense, environmental quality, highway systems, which are club goods really, but for the most part they operate like pure public goods when they're not congested. And the bulk of the government's expenditures were on things of that sort, at least at the national level at that point. Social Security was growing in importance, and after the 1960 adoption of Medicare and Medicaid, those programs also started to grow, but they were still relatively small compared to the expenditures on pure public goods. Well, after 1970, 1980, those insurance programs continued to expand, especially the ones involving medical insurance. And it's now the case that these insurance-like programs make up the largest part of the budget. And so we've gone from the sort of Samuelsonian model where because markets do not provide sufficient levels of pure public goods, that governments might be asked to intervene by their citizens and provide more of those services, to a situation that's more like the pragmatic Meltzer-Richards type model where we have pure private goods being subsidized, and subsidized in a manner that in some ways resembles a demogrant program, and that those programs have grown rapidly for the past 50 years and are now quite large. And this is partly just pragmatic interests in receiving discounts on these types of services, but also kind of reinforced by ideological shifts that have been taking place during the past 50 years. If you go back and look at the charts that I put up on the very first lecture to try to persuade you that public economics is important, something we should be studying, and we should try to understand not only just the effects of public policies on the private sector, but also why those public policies are in place. That this sort of model can help explain the trajectory we saw in a lot of those expenditure categories that were put up on the screen during that first lecture. So take a look at those slides. I'm not going to reproduce them here, and I didn't reproduce them in the notes because we've already done those once. Just go back and look at that introductory lecture in the part that went through some data sets. And with that, that completes part 4 of the lecture block. And I'll record one more lecture that will be more or less the beginning of the next part, which is on the choice of tax systems, sometimes called optimal tax theory. With that, thank you. I'll see you later.